There are betrayals that cut so deep they redefine your understanding of trust, friendship, and human nature itself. For me, that betrayal came on a Wednesday afternoon in March when I discovered that my closest friend had shared my most painful secret with hundreds of strangers on social media, reducing my trauma to entertainment for people who didn't even know my name. My name is Rachel, and I'm 28 years old. The secret that destroyed my friendship and nearly destroyed my life was something I had never planned to tell anyone. But when you trust someone completely, you sometimes reveal parts of yourself that should remain protected. The friendship that would ultimately cause me such devastating pain began during our freshman year of college. I met Stephanie in our introduction to psychology class, where we were randomly paired for a semester-long research project on anxiety disorders. What started as an academic partnership quickly developed into a deep friendship built on shared interests, similar senses of humor, and what I believed was mutual respect and loyalty. Stephanie was everything I wished I could be: confident, outgoing, naturally charismatic, and seemingly unafraid of anything life could throw at her. She had the kind of magnetic personality that drew people to her effortlessly, and I felt grateful to be included in her inner circle. Where I was cautious and reserved, she was bold and adventurous. Where I worried about what others thought, she appeared completely secure in her own worth and uninterested in external validation. Our friendship deepened over the 4 years of college as we navigated the typical challenges of young adulthood together. We were roommates for 2 years, study partners for countless exams, and each other's emotional support through breakups, family drama, and the existential crises that seemed to define the college experience. Stephanie was the person I called when I needed advice, the friend who would drive across town to bring me soup when I was sick, and the only person who could make me laugh when everything felt overwhelming. After graduation, we both moved to the same city and maintained our close friendship despite the demands of starting careers and building adult lives. We lived in different neighborhoods, but saw each other regularly, continuing the tradition of long phone calls, spontaneous dinner plans, and weekend adventures that had characterized our college years. To everyone who knew us, we were best friends in the truest sense, inseparable, loyal, and genuinely invested in each other's happiness and success. The secret that would eventually destroy our friendship was rooted in a trauma I had experienced during my childhood, something so painful and shameful that I had never spoken about it to anyone until I shared it with Stephanie. The abuse I suffered at the hands of my uncle when I was 12 years old was a wound that had never fully healed, despite years of therapy and tremendous effort to move beyond its impact on my life. For 16 years, I carried this secret alone, letting it shape my relationships, my self-worth, and my ability to trust others in ways that I didn't fully understand until I was much older. The shame and confusion that surrounded the experience made it feel like something that was my fault, something dirty and wrong that I needed to hide from the world. Even my parents didn't know what had happened, though they suspected something had changed in me during that difficult year when I became withdrawn and fearful. The decision to tell Stephanie about the abuse wasn't planned or deliberate. It happened during one of our regular Friday night wine sessions, 3 years after college, when we were discussing relationships and intimacy in the abstract way that close friends do when they've had just enough alcohol to lower their usual defenses. The conversation had turned to trust and vulnerability, and Stephanie had shared some of her own experiences with toxic relationships and family dysfunction. In that moment of closeness and mutual disclosure, I felt safe enough to reveal the secret I had carried for so long. I told her about my uncle, about the confusion and terror of being 12 years old and having someone who was supposed to protect me instead hurt me in ways I couldn't understand. I explained how the experience had affected my ability to trust men, to feel safe in intimate relationships, and to believe that I deserved love and respect. Stephanie's reaction in that moment was everything I could have hoped for from a true friend. She listened without judgment, offered comfort without trying to minimize my pain, and assured me that sharing this with her would never change how she saw me or our friendship. She told me how brave I was for surviving something so traumatic and for trusting her with something so personal. She promised that my secret would remain between us, that she understood how important confidentiality was when someone shares their deepest pain. For months after that conversation, I felt lighter and more connected to Stephanie than ever before. Sharing my secret had deepened our friendship in ways I hadn't expected, making me feel truly known and accepted by someone I cared about deeply. Stephanie never brought up the subject unless I initiated the conversation, but when I did need to talk about it, she was always available to listen and provide support. The benefits of having shared this burden extended beyond just my friendship with Stephanie. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I wasn't carrying this enormous secret alone. Having one person who knew my full story and still loved and respected me gave me confidence to begin addressing some of the ways the trauma had affected my romantic relationships and my overall mental health. I started therapy again, this time with a new therapist who specialized in childhood trauma and sexual abuse. I began dating more seriously, feeling like I could be honest with potential partners about my past when and if the relationship progressed to that level of intimacy. I even started considering whether I might someday be ready to tell my parents the truth about what had happened, something that had seemed impossible before I experienced the relief of sharing my secret with someone I trusted. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Wednesday morning when I arrived at work to find several colleagues looking at me with expressions I couldn't quite interpret. There was something in their eyes that suggested they knew something about me that they hadn't known before, a kind of sympathetic curiosity that made me immediately uncomfortable. When I asked if something was wrong, they assured me that everything was fine, but their behavior remained strange and overly solicitous throughout the day. It wasn't until I got home that evening and checked my social media accounts that I understood what had happened. Stephanie had posted a long, detailed account of my childhood abuse on her public Facebook page, presenting it as an inspirational story about overcoming trauma and finding strength in vulnerability. She had used my real name, included specific details about the abuse that I had shared with her in confidence, and even tagged mutual friends who she thought would be interested in reading about my journey of healing and resilience. The post had been shared dozens of times and had received hundreds of comments from people I didn't know, expressing everything from sympathy and outrage to unwanted advice and invasive questions about my experience. Strangers were discussing the most painful and private aspects of my life as if they were characters in a story rather than real events that had shaped who I was as a person. The discovery of this betrayal was so shocking and devastating that I initially thought there must be some mistake. I read and reread the post, hoping that somehow I had misunderstood what I was seeing or that this was about someone else who happened to share similar experiences. But there was no mistaking the specific details that only Stephanie could have known, the exact phrases I had used when telling her about my uncle, and the particular way I had described the impact of the abuse on my adult relationships. My first instinct was to call Stephanie immediately and demand an explanation for what seemed like an incomprehensible violation of my privacy and trust. When she answered the phone, her voice was bright and cheerful, as if nothing unusual had happened. She asked about my day and made casual conversation as though she hadn't just exposed my deepest trauma to hundreds of strangers without my knowledge or consent. When I finally managed to confront her about the post, Stephanie's reaction was not the horror and remorse I had expected. Instead, she seemed surprised and slightly annoyed that I was upset about something she viewed as a positive and inspiring sharing of my story. She explained that she had been moved by my strength and resilience and wanted to help other people who might be struggling with similar experiences by showing them that healing and recovery were possible. Her justification for posting my story without permission was that she thought it would help people, that sharing stories of overcoming trauma was important for reducing stigma and encouraging others to seek help. She claimed that she had been trying to honor my journey and celebrate my courage in a way that would benefit others who might be suffering in silence. When I tried to explain how violated and betrayed I felt, how my private trauma was never meant to be public inspiration for strangers, Stephanie's response was dismissive and defensive. She accused me of being ungrateful for the support and positive responses the post had received. She pointed out that many people had commented about how inspired they felt by my story and how it had encouraged them to seek their own healing. Most hurtfully, she suggested that my reaction was evidence that I was still ashamed of my experience and hadn't truly healed from the trauma. She implied that if I had really processed and overcome the abuse, I would be comfortable with others knowing about it and would want to use my story to help other survivors. She made me feel like my desire for privacy was somehow wrong or unhealthy, as if wanting to control who knew about my most painful experiences was a sign of continued trauma rather than a reasonable boundary. The conversation escalated into an argument that revealed fundamental differences in how we viewed privacy, consent, and the ownership of personal stories. Stephanie seemed genuinely unable to understand why I would want to keep my trauma private when sharing it could potentially help others. She viewed my story as a resource that could benefit the greater good, rather than as a deeply personal experience that belonged to me alone. When I demanded that she remove the post immediately, Stephanie initially refused, arguing that it would be selfish to delete something that was helping so many people. She showed me comments from strangers who said that reading about my experience had given them hope or encouraged them to seek therapy. She seemed to believe that the positive impact of the post justified the violation of my privacy, and that my discomfort was less important than the potential benefits to others. The argument ended with Stephanie finally agreeing to delete the post, but not before making it clear that she thought I was being dramatic and self-centered. Her final comment before hanging up was that it had just been a way of celebrating my strength and that she couldn't understand why I was treating her gesture of friendship like a betrayal. She said it was just her way of showing how proud she was of me, as if my outrage was an overreaction to what she saw as a compliment. The damage, however, had already been done. In the hours that the post had been live, it had been shared and screenshotted by dozens of people, ensuring that my story would continue to circulate even after the original post was deleted. Screenshots had been posted in various support groups and forums, always without my consent and often without any context about how the story had been shared in the first place. More immediately devastating was the realization that my private trauma was now known by numerous people in my personal and professional circles. Colleagues, acquaintances, and distant friends had all seen the most vulnerable and painful details of my childhood, turning interactions that should have been normal and casual into awkward encounters filled with unwanted sympathy and invasive curiosity. The impact on my mental health was immediate and severe. The shame and helplessness I had worked so hard to overcome came flooding back with crushing intensity. I felt exposed and vulnerable in ways that reminded me powerfully of how I had felt as a 12-year-old child who couldn't protect herself from an adult who was supposed to keep her safe. The violation of having my story shared without consent brought back all the feelings of powerlessness and betrayal that I had experienced during the original trauma. Sleep became difficult as I lay awake at night, thinking about all the strangers who now knew intimate details about my worst experiences. I found myself constantly checking social media to see if the story was being shared in new places, compulsively searching for any mention of my name or my experience. The anxiety of not knowing who had seen the post or where my story might surface next was consuming and exhausting. Work became challenging as I struggled to interact normally with colleagues who I knew had read about my trauma. Some people tried to be supportive in ways that only highlighted how much they now knew about my private life. Others seemed to avoid me entirely, perhaps unsure of how to behave around someone whose painful history they had learned about through social media rather than through any natural development of our relationship. The betrayal by Stephanie was perhaps even more devastating than the public exposure itself. Losing someone I had considered my closest friend and most trusted confidant left me feeling isolated and questioning my ability to judge character or maintain healthy relationships. If someone I had known and trusted for nearly a decade could violate my privacy so completely and then dismiss my feelings about it, how could I ever trust anyone else with vulnerable information about myself? The weeks following the incident were marked by a profound sense of grief and disorientation. I was mourning not just the loss of my friendship with Stephanie, but also the loss of my sense of safety and privacy. The carefully constructed boundaries I had built around my trauma had been demolished, leaving me feeling exposed and defenseless in ways that required starting my healing process over from the beginning. My therapist helped me understand that what Stephanie had done constituted a serious violation of my autonomy and consent, regardless of her stated intentions. She explained that sharing someone's trauma story without permission is a form of re-victimization that can be just as damaging as the original abuse. Having my story taken from me and used for purposes I hadn't consented to was its own form of trauma that would require processing and healing. The legal implications of what Stephanie had done were complicated and ultimately not worth pursuing. While she had clearly violated my privacy in ways that felt criminal, the laws around sharing personal information on social media are complex and varied. The time, money, and emotional energy required to pursue legal action would have been enormous, and there was no guarantee of a favorable outcome. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my sense of privacy and control in whatever ways were possible. I changed my social media settings to be more restrictive, blocked or unfriended anyone who might have seen the original post, and had difficult conversations with close friends and family members about what had happened and how they could support me moving forward. The conversation with my parents was particularly challenging. They learned about my childhood abuse not through my careful disclosure when I felt ready, but through the aftermath of Stephanie's betrayal. Having to explain both the original trauma and the recent violation of my privacy was overwhelming and painful, but my parents' response was supportive and loving in ways that helped me remember that not everyone would use my vulnerabilities against me. Some of my other friends were equally supportive, expressing outrage at Stephanie's behavior and offering practical help in dealing with the aftermath. They helped me monitor social media for any continued sharing of my story, provided emotional support during the worst moments of anxiety and depression, and demonstrated through their actions what trustworthy friendship actually looked like. The process of rebuilding my sense of trust and safety took months of intensive therapy and tremendous effort. I had to relearn how to share personal information gradually and appropriately, how to recognize red flags in relationships that might indicate someone who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information, and how to set and maintain boundaries around my personal history. One of the most difficult aspects of recovery was learning to forgive myself for trusting Stephanie in the first place. I spent countless hours analyzing our friendship for signs that I should have recognized, clues that might have indicated she wasn't trustworthy with such sensitive information. My therapist helped me understand that there was nothing in Stephanie's previous behavior that would have predicted this level of betrayal, and that my desire to trust a close friend was natural and healthy rather than naive or foolish. The incident also forced me to confront some of my assumptions about friendship and loyalty. I had believed that close friendships were built on unshakable foundations of mutual respect and consideration, that someone who claimed to love and care about me would never deliberately hurt me in such a profound way. Learning that even people who genuinely care about us can cause tremendous harm through thoughtlessness or selfishness was a painful but important lesson about the complexity of human relationships. Stephanie made several attempts to contact me in the months following the incident, sending texts and emails that alternated between apologies and continued justifications for her behavior. Her messages revealed that she still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she had done or why I was so deeply hurt by her actions. She continued to frame the incident as a misunderstanding rather than a serious violation of my trust and autonomy. In one particularly tone-deaf message, she suggested that we could repair our friendship if I could just get past my feelings about the post and focus on all the positive aspects of our relationship. She seemed to believe that the years of good friendship should outweigh this one incident, failing to understand that some betrayals are so fundamental that they change the entire context of a relationship. I eventually stopped responding to her attempts at contact, recognizing that continued engagement was only prolonging my healing process and preventing me from moving forward. The closure I needed would have to come from within myself rather than from any acknowledgement or apology from Stephanie that would satisfy my need for justice and understanding. The impact of the betrayal extended to other relationships in ways I hadn't anticipated. I became more cautious about sharing personal information with friends, more vigilant about social media privacy settings, and more selective about who I trusted with sensitive details about my life. While these changes were probably healthy and protective, they also created distance in relationships that might have developed into deeper connections if I hadn't been so guarded. Dating became more complicated as I struggled with when and how to share information about my past with romantic partners. The violation of having my story shared without consent made me hypersensitive to any indication that someone might not respect my boundaries or might use personal information inappropriately. Several potentially promising relationships ended because I was too afraid to be vulnerable or because I interpreted normal curiosity as invasive interest. The professional consequences were also significant. Several colleagues and professional contacts had seen the original post, making networking events and work meetings awkward as I wondered who knew about my personal history and how it might affect their perception of me professionally. Some people seemed to treat me differently after learning about my trauma, either with excessive sympathy that felt patronizing or with uncomfortable distance that suggested they didn't know how to interact with someone who had experienced abuse. Over time, I learned to navigate these challenges with greater skill and confidence. I developed strategies for addressing the situation when necessary, scripts for explaining to new friends and colleagues that I preferred not to discuss certain aspects of my personal history, and techniques for recognizing when someone's interest in my story was healthy versus exploitative. The healing process also involved grieving the loss of privacy that could never be fully restored. Once information has been shared widely on social media, it's impossible to completely control who has access to it or how it might surface in the future. Learning to accept this reality while still maintaining appropriate boundaries was an ongoing challenge that required tremendous emotional resilience. One unexpected outcome of the experience was a deeper understanding of consent and boundaries that extended far beyond my own situation. I became much more conscious of how casually people share information about others, how often personal stories are treated as entertainment or inspiration without considering the impact on the people whose lives they represent, and how important it is to ask permission before sharing someone else's experiences, even with the best of intentions. The incident also highlighted the ways that social media has complicated traditional notions of privacy and friendship. The ease with which personal information can be shared with large audiences, often without malicious intent, creates new categories of betrayal and violation that previous generations didn't have to navigate. The permanence and searchability of digital information means that momentary lapses in judgment can have lasting consequences that extend far beyond the original audience. 3 years after the incident, I can say that I've largely healed from both the original trauma and the secondary trauma of having my story shared without consent. The process required tremendous effort and support, but it also led to a deeper understanding of my own strength and resilience. I learned that I could survive having my most painful secrets exposed, and that my worth as a person wasn't diminished by other people knowing about my experiences. The relationship with Stephanie never recovered, though I eventually reached a place of forgiveness that was more about my own peace than about absolving her of responsibility for what she had done. I came to understand that her behavior reflected her own emotional limitations and poor judgment rather than any inherent flaw in my character or my worthiness of respect and consideration. Today, I'm more selective about who I trust with personal information, but I haven't closed myself off from the possibility of deep friendships or intimate relationships. I've learned to recognize the difference between healthy curiosity and inappropriate intrusion, between supportive friends who respect boundaries and those who see personal information as entertainment or inspiration to be shared. The experience taught me that betrayal is always possible in any relationship, but that this reality doesn't mean we should avoid vulnerability entirely. Instead, it means we should be thoughtful about how and when we share sensitive information, clear about our expectations for confidentiality, and prepared to protect ourselves when those expectations aren't met. My story is ultimately about more than just one friend's poor judgment in sharing personal information online. It's about the importance of consent in all its forms, the value of privacy as a fundamental human right, and the ways that seemingly well-intentioned actions can cause profound harm when they ignore the autonomy and dignity of others. The phrase that Stephanie used to justify her behavior, that it was just a joke or just a way of celebrating my strength, reflects a common misunderstanding about the nature of personal stories and who has the right to share them. Our most painful and vulnerable experiences belong to us, and no one else has the right to use them for any purpose, no matter how noble or well-intentioned, without our explicit consent. The healing process taught me that recovery from betrayal is possible, but it requires acknowledging the full extent of the harm that was done and working through the complex emotions of anger, grief, and loss that result from having trust violated so completely. It also requires rebuilding one's sense of safety and control gradually, with the support of trustworthy people who understand the importance of boundaries and consent. The secret that Stephanie shared online was never meant to be inspiration for strangers or a tool for helping others. It was my private pain, my journey of healing, and my choice about when and how to share it. The fact that some people found it helpful or inspiring doesn't justify the violation of my privacy or the trauma of having my story taken from me without permission. In the end, the most important lesson I learned was that my story belongs to me, and I have the right to control how and when it's shared with others. This isn't about shame or secrecy, but about autonomy and respect. Everyone deserves to have their privacy protected and their boundaries honored, especially by those who claim to care about them most. The betrayal that redefined my understanding of friendship and trust ultimately led to a deeper appreciation for relationships built on genuine respect and consideration. While I wouldn't choose to experience such a violation again, it taught me valuable lessons about my own strength and about the importance of surrounding myself with people who understand that love and friendship require protecting, not exploiting, each other's vulnerabilities. True friendship means honoring someone's trust, respecting their boundaries, and understanding that some stories are not ours to tell, no matter how inspiring or helpful we think they might be to others. The people who truly care about us will ask before sharing, respect our right to privacy, and understand that our most painful experiences are not entertainment or inspiration to be consumed by strangers, but sacred parts of ourselves that deserve protection and care. The journey of rebuilding my life after this betrayal involved many small steps and incremental victories that slowly restored my sense of agency and control. I had to relearn how to trust my own judgment about people, how to set appropriate boundaries in new relationships, and how to share personal information in ways that felt safe and intentional rather than reckless or naive. One of the most challenging aspects of recovery was dealing with the random encounters with people who had read about my story online. Months after the original post had been deleted, I would occasionally meet someone at a party or professional event who would mention having seen something about my experiences on social media. These encounters were always awkward and uncomfortable, forcing me to navigate conversations about my trauma with people who felt they knew intimate details about my life despite being complete strangers. Some of these interactions revealed the best in human nature, with people expressing genuine compassion and offering support in appropriate ways. But others were intrusive and inappropriate, with individuals asking follow-up questions about my experiences or offering unsolicited advice about healing and recovery. A few people even suggested that I should be grateful for the exposure because it might help other survivors, echoing Stephanie's original justification for her violation of my privacy. These encounters taught me important lessons about setting boundaries and protecting my emotional energy. I developed standard responses for different types of inappropriate questions and learned to redirect conversations when they veered into territory that felt invasive or exploitative. I also learned to recognize the difference between genuine concern and voyeuristic curiosity, helping me identify people who might be safe to build relationships with versus those who saw my story as entertainment. The impact on my family relationships was also significant and required careful navigation. My parents, who learned about my childhood abuse through the aftermath of Stephanie's betrayal rather than through my own carefully planned disclosure, needed time to process both pieces of information simultaneously. They struggled with guilt about not knowing what had happened to me as a child, anger at Stephanie for violating my privacy, and confusion about how to support me through the secondary trauma. My siblings had varying reactions to learning about both my childhood abuse and the recent betrayal. Some were supportive and protective, expressing outrage at Stephanie's behavior and offering practical help in dealing with the fallout. Others seemed uncomfortable with the information and withdrew from me emotionally, perhaps unsure of how to relate to someone whose painful history they had learned about in such a public and traumatic way. The extended family dynamics were particularly complicated during holiday gatherings and family events in the months following the incident. Some relatives had seen the original post or heard about it through the family grapevine, creating an undercurrent of awkwardness and unwanted sympathy that made normal family interactions feel strained and artificial. I found myself dreading family gatherings that I had previously enjoyed, anticipating uncomfortable conversations and invasive questions about my experiences. The professional ramifications continued to unfold over many months as the story circulated through various networks and communities. Colleagues who had initially been supportive sometimes became overly protective or paternalistic, treating me as if I were fragile or incapable of handling normal workplace challenges. Others seemed to view me differently after learning about my trauma, perhaps questioning my emotional stability or professional competence in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. One particularly difficult situation arose when I was considered for a promotion that would have involved public speaking and representing my company at industry events. Although I was qualified for the position and had been performing well in my current role, I sensed that some decision-makers were concerned about my personal history becoming public knowledge and potentially reflecting poorly on the organization. The promotion ultimately went to a less qualified candidate, and while I couldn't prove that my trauma history was a factor in the decision, the timing and circumstances suggested that it had influenced the outcome. These professional setbacks were particularly frustrating because they represented a form of ongoing punishment for something that had been done to me without my consent. Not only had I been victimized by my uncle as a child and betrayed by my friend as an adult, but I was now facing career consequences for having these experiences shared publicly against my will. The injustice of this situation was overwhelming and contributed to periods of anger and depression that required additional therapeutic support. The therapeutic process of healing from this betrayal involved working through complex feelings of shame, anger, and grief that were different from but related to the emotions I had processed around my original trauma. My therapist helped me understand that secondary trauma from violations of privacy and consent can be just as damaging as primary trauma, and that my intense emotional response to Stephanie's betrayal was completely appropriate and justified. One of the most important insights from therapy was understanding how the violation of my privacy had triggered many of the same psychological responses as my childhood abuse. In both cases, someone I trusted had used their knowledge of my vulnerabilities to harm me, leaving me feeling powerless and exposed. The betrayal by Stephanie had essentially re-traumatized me by recreating the dynamics of violation and helplessness that I had experienced as a child. Learning to separate my anger at Stephanie from my anger at my uncle required careful therapeutic work and a lot of time. Initially, the two betrayals felt connected and indistinguishable, leaving me feeling like I was reliving my childhood trauma rather than dealing with a separate incident. Understanding the differences between the two experiences while acknowledging their emotional connections was essential for my healing process. I eventually found a specialized support group for people who had experienced violations of privacy and consent in the digital age. This group included individuals who had been victims of various forms of online harassment and exploitation. Being surrounded by people who understood the unique challenges of having personal information weaponized against you was incredibly validating and healing. The dating world remained challenging for several years after the incident, as I struggled to find the balance between necessary self-protection and healthy vulnerability in romantic relationships. I had to learn to distinguish between partners who were genuinely interested in understanding and supporting me versus those who seemed fascinated by my trauma history in ways that felt exploitative. Eventually, I did find a partner who understood and respected my experiences without being defined by them. Building a healthy relationship required tremendous courage and vulnerability on my part, as well as patience and understanding from someone who recognized that my caution came from real harm rather than irrational fear. Over time, I learned to view my recovery not as a destination, but as an ongoing process of growth and adaptation. The betrayal by Stephanie had changed me in fundamental ways, but not all of those changes were negative. I became more discerning about relationships, more assertive about boundaries, and more compassionate toward others who had experienced violations of trust and privacy. The incident also deepened my understanding of consent in all its forms and applications. I became more conscious of seeking permission before sharing others' stories or information, more aware of the impact that seemingly innocent social media posts could have on the people they featured, and more committed to respecting others' autonomy over their personal narratives. Looking back now, 5 years after the incident, I can see how the betrayal ultimately led to positive changes in my life, even though I wouldn't choose to experience it again. The violation forced me to develop stronger boundaries, better judgment about people's character, and a clearer understanding of my own worth and rights. The secret that Stephanie shared online was never just a story or an inspiration. It was my life, my pain, and my journey. The fact that some people found it helpful or moving doesn't justify the violation of my privacy or the trauma of having my story taken from me without consent. My experience belongs to me, and I have the right to control how and when it's shared with others. The healing process taught me that betrayal is survivable, that trust can be rebuilt gradually and carefully, and that violations of privacy and consent are serious forms of harm that deserve recognition and response. Most importantly, it taught me that my worth isn't diminished by others knowing about my painful experiences, and that I can be selective about who deserves access to my vulnerability without being closed off from meaningful connections entirely. The phrase, "it was just a joke," will always remind me of how people can minimize serious harm by reframing it as something less significant than it actually was. But jokes require shared understanding and mutual consent. When someone's deepest pain becomes entertainment for others without their permission, it's not humor but exploitation. Understanding this distinction has helped me recognize and respond to other forms of minimization and gaslighting in various relationships and contexts. Today, I share my story on my own terms when I choose to, with people I trust, for purposes I believe in. The difference between voluntary disclosure and violation of privacy is consent, and that difference matters more than any potential positive outcome that might result from unauthorized sharing of personal information. My experience is mine to give or withhold, and respecting that autonomy is fundamental to respecting me as a human being.